Let's shift to today. Peyton Falzone, I think, is the place you have to start, right? He is the prime 2026 prospect on campus today. Tight end, quarterback. How do you juggle that? I don't know. But every time he visits, we're going to certainly keep trying to learn more. I would expect Penn State to have him in the quarterback room today and to have him watching Danny O'Brien and the quarterbacks for the most part, because that seems to be like what Peyton wants, where Peyton wants to play. He did just post a pretty impressive 100-meter time. Sean, did you see that before we started the podcast? His latest tweet?
I believe 10.68 hand time, which is
10. It's a 10.9 fat, but yeah, it's still. But for a player his size and the athleticism he's shown, anything under 11, I think is really pretty good. So
he checks out on film too. Like that's not something that just came out of nowhere.
We knew he keeps working with Mandler too.
That's part of the projection there.
Yeah, but. Ryan, can I jump in on that part
go
too?
On,
I want to.
You've been waiting for this for weeks, by the way, and I know you have. We haven't gotten to it.
So we can't reduce the conversation about Peyton Falzone being a quarterback to just his throwing motion, because it's not just his throwing motion. It's also his decision making and the neck up part of being a quarterback. You can go through the through line of Bo Pribula and Drew Allar to Jaxson Smolik. I'd say Beckham Kritza is the one that kind of breaks from this trend. Penn State recruits quarterbacks from the neck up, guys that can play the position that on the high school level, from what I've seen, have a really strong decision-making ability. And so I think that's also an area where Peyton Falzone has to make a conversation. He has to change that narrative as well based on the film. And that's not going to happen until the fall. So it is a big thing. The throwing motion is a big part of this, and it is probably the foundational part, but it is not just that. There has to be other parts of this, to me, at least from my how I feel about the quarterback position, where he needs to improve on those areas as well to really be a serious quarterback prospect. Now, as a second quarterback in a class, I think that might not need to happen, but the projection of it, is he going to be successful? I still think that's part of the conversation as well. So I'm sorry you're right. I have been sitting and stewing on that for a while, because we're reducing this conversation to, can he fix his throwing motion? And I just think that there's a bigger part of playing quarterback than just that, because it is so multifaceted. You can't just have an elite quarterback that doesn't read coverage. Like we've seen that other places, it doesn't work. So anyway.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I still think it's TBD. You look at his recruitment and you see that he's got official visits set to Utah and Iowa. None of the regional schools have set up official, or he at least hasn't put it out that he's got official visits set up to regional schools, which is, I think, very interesting, because you look at, those guys well. Penn State knows them, Maryland, Rutgers, Boston College, all these schools that maybe were in on him early with offers, have not set up that official visit yet. And I know Penn State wants him, but I also know that Penn State knows that what kind of athlete he is, and knows what kind of success they've had with similar type athletes, not always at quarterback. And I also know that he wants to play quarterback. So just a very fascinating recruitment. And he keeps going up in terms of rankings and stuff like that. And I'm just fascinated to see how this one plays out, because it's not always like just, between the lines, black and white in terms of quarterback recruitment. So this is one that's got me, I don't want to say confused, but like I could see it going several different directions. And if he wants to play quarterback, it might not go in this direction.
Ryan, I absolutely railroaded you, so I wanted you to continue your thought there of what you were talking about on Peyton Falzone before I did that.
All of it's fair. No, you're good, man. I think Penn State has more interest in a quarterback than you two think. Just from the feedback I've gotten, I do. Now, I think that they probably also want that out there too to help recruiting, right? So I see why that's feedback that I've gotten more in recent months than maybe we were getting, back in the fall, and especially after camp. So time will tell. Troy Huhn's committed. We haven't even brought up Gavin Sidwar, Sean. That maybe will be a discussion for another day, but he's doing pretty well on the. He just don't know 2.7 still, right? I think
I'm sorry. Well, you cut out there for a second.
I transitioned quick to Sidwar. He's doing 2.7 still, right?
I don't know. I'm sorry.
Okay. Anyway, his stock's on the rise. So my point is, there are two pretty good Pennsylvania I don't want to say legit 100% quarterback prospects because we'll see with Peyton Falzone, but Sidward's in there too. Right now, the discussion still seems to be that Troy Huhn is the guy, and I don't really get the impression that they are massively pushing for a second quarterback, but I think that they have two guys in this state that have their attention, at least. We'll leave it at that.
I think people saw Troy Huhn's ranking go down and think that Penn State now is souring on him.
That's not the case at all.
That's
not the case at all.
Right. And that's kind of where we're kind of at, because I think there was a mailbag question last week that was like, Penn State's obviously looking for a 2 quarterback class. I'm not sure that's the case. Like, they may end up with one, absolutely, but I don't think that. I think there's some dots that were connected, but like with the wrong lines. So I think that there's a lot to, there's a lot of time to go. And of course, Troy's coming in for a week, and like the dedication that they've shown to Penn State since he committed to them last summer, and since they committed to him last summer, it's pretty impressive, because I think he went to more playoff games than I did. And he's got a lot going for him in terms of like the relationship that he's got with Danny O'Brien, James Franklin, all those guys.
And nothing changed. He's still a good quarterback prospect. I think that's the part that fans are kind of confused on, is like, this is still a guy who is big, strong, good arm, makes reasonably good decisions. And like from the neck up is a good quarterback.
Last 2 things I want to say real quick. Troy Huhn, I think there's an information gap, and that played a part in that ranking. It is what it is when it's a lot easier to get certain information on other players, and there's a lack of information on Troy. Now there are, full game film out there and stuff, and Charles and them did watch that, and then that was his decision, and that's why we're not in the rankings. I will add one last thing though, is that there are some massive powerhouse programs in Southern California who have been knocking on Huhn's door. So I don't think he's leaving or anything like that, but I know that programs, the big ones out there, are interested in getting him in their program. So he must have shown them something, and they live a lot closer than we do as far as what they see from Troy Huhn. And, I don't know anything about if he would leave or anything like that, but I can confidently say that those schools have been interested and have inquired about him.
Troy runs an RPO offense. So he's a drop back passer that runs an RPO offense. There's some things in the tape and in the productivity that I think are fair to rank him where he is, but are also a product of the situation. These things are not in a vacuum. Same thing with Peyton Falzone. He runs a system where if they give him the green light, it's bombs away. Fitz, you've been talking about his completion percentage. That's fair. And the throwing motion and all those things can help with that. But it's also, that's what I'm trying to say. The decision-making, the offensive context, they're all part of this. That isn't just ranking height, weight, strength. There's just so many factors that go into quarterback. It's why I love it, and why it's also unbelievably frustrating to talk about, because you can't boil it down to one thing.
Yeah, you can't, but you also can't get inside that guy's head. And that's what you're trying to say in terms of the decision making. And that's why 5 of the top 10, 6 of the top 10 quarterbacks in any given class are going to transfer, because number one, that's the position. And number 2, you don't know how they're going to handle everything. Penn State's brought in some guys that have been really, really good looking quarterback prospects, and it just hasn't panned out. Whereas they bring in some guys that maybe don't have the physical gifts, and it works out. Now, we don't make those rules. There are probably exceptions there, more so than rules, but there's no blueprint, there's no prototype in terms of how this is going to work out. And you've seen it at every level. Professional scouts who don't give out stars, who don't, work and write articles and stuff like that, they get this wrong all the time as well. It's really, 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 really hard to scout a quarterback with certainty. And it's funny because Ryan and I are talking in the chat here. The different Ryan are talking in the chat, and he says, "Is one of those guys a surefire NFL quarterback?" I said, "Well, if you got one, send it along, because there's no such thing as a surefire NFL quarterback." And yes, we've seen guys that are number 1 prospect go number 1 overall. But
yeah,
man,
remember Kyle McCord had to have him. Not to be
Drew Allar had to have him.
Yeah. I mean, you've got a lot to work in those 3 years that you're going to be there, or 3-4 years for some. There's a lot of progress that gets made, even if you're phenomenally talented, phenomenally physically talented, mentally there, all that kind of stuff. All that progress has to happen, and sometimes it flat out doesn't, and sometimes guys don't give it a chance to happen. So it's an interesting look at quarterback recruiting, just because it's such a crapshoot. And you can say that about any position, but when it's the most important position on the field and you have the ball in your hands every play, you kind of see it a little bit more.
Yeah. What I guess the flow of the quarterback roster with Allar and then a quarterback competition coming up after Allar is done in 2025. Ryan, you said they're not pushing super hard for a second quarterback to your understanding.
Well,
why? I mean, it feels like this would be a time to do that, or is it kind of like, I guess I'm curious about that.
I think it's spring. I think talk to me in a month and a half. Yeah, like see your room. Figure out your room. This is going to be a good chance for them to see what Beckham Kritza has. Jaxson Smolik obviously came back late, but this is a chance for Jaxson to show progression. So I think that the discussion at the moment on March 27th is that. Talk to me on April 27th, and it might be a different thing. So it's always fluid with recruiting, but I always stress to people that, and we've talked about this many times on message boards and even in this, is like this spring practice period has a real impact on how things go. It's not just the transfer portal. It absolutely impacts how they look at their class, because they're going to see a couple guys who maybe they were like, time will tell, and they rise. They're going to see a couple guys who highly touted, and boy, they got a long way to go. And that usually impacts one or two things.
And when you're going out and seeing quarterbacks throw in the spring, you're not just seeing them.
That too.
You're not just seeing them throw football. You're talking to their coaches. You're talking to their teachers. You're talking to people around them to see how they're wired. And I think going back to what T. Frank said about 10 minutes ago, the guys that they've brought in, specifically the first three guys right now, are wired in a certain way. Like Jaxson Smolik is wired right. Ethan Grunkemeyer wired right. Drew, I think is wired right. And I think the difference there is you see Drew's, I don't want to call them shortcomings, but you see the lapses that he has in that, because he's always the guy with the ball, always the guy in the field, always the guy on camera. You don't know how those other guys are going to react, but they have the right mindset. They have the right ability to go and attack it. So you've got a lot going for you, and you want to continue that line of thought. You want to continue the process that you're working through. I think Bork probably fits that a lot in the 2027 class, circling back around to our 2027 conversation. Peter Bork fits what they want to do physically and mentally. And that's, it's not always the easiest thing to do. T. Frank, we talked in the chat last week at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. There was a really good question about, hey, James Franklin obviously wants the quarterback run to be a part of his offense. Absolutely. Always has, always wanted that. But, you've got Drew, you've got, you're recruiting Troy Huhn, you're recruiting guys, Beckham Kritza is not a runner. Like, you're recruiting guys that aren't runners. So how do you mesh the best qualities of what you're going to bring in with the best qualities of what your what your offense has to do to be productive?
Yeah, it's first off, I think there's an overemphasis on the idea that the quarterback run is a skill you have to have. It is about numbers and how the defense reacts to your run game, which should be the what fuels your offense. It's more about, I was actually watching Joe Moorhead, and sorry to attack this from a couple of different areas. I was watching a clinic from Joe Moorhead, and he had a quote from Chip Kelly: first down, touchdown, first down, get down. That's the goal of a quarterback on the option play. If you can get a touchdown and you got the alley and it's wide open, the Red Sea parts, go get a touchdown. Get the first down.
Comment, by the way.
And if you can't, get your ass down and don't take a hit. That's what you're expecting from the quarterback run game. But if you've got a Matt Zollers or a Justin Fields or a Peyton Falzone who does everything, everybody wants that guy. What do you choose when you have to choose? And Penn State chooses quarterback over athlete. Now, they'll take some guys that have both. Will Levis could have been both, but they primarily go with, when they have to make even a decision there, the guy who operates the offense correctly and is the quarterback first, and whatever he gives us as a runner is enough. Andy Kotelnicki's offense is a separate conversation of his leaning into that triple option football, like Joe Moorhead, a return to some of that stuff, but it is absolutely not the driving force of what they're looking for in a quarterback. They want guys that win from the neck up.